Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima reporting from Kiev, Ukraine. In today's podcast, the week 49th of war in Ukraine, and this is the first week of February 2023. We're going to talk about the recent updates from the front lines. We're going to talk about Putin bluffing and that still he's afraid of NATO and tank coalition in Ukraine for Ukraine. So, what's been happening at the front lines recently? So, while the Ukraine armed forces hold in defense, Russians are trying to attack. Generally, the front line remained where it was in mid-January. In recent days, the Russian forces have launched at least two powerful counterattacks, and whatever is left of Russian private army Wagner Group is still attacking in the Bakhmut area. The most severest battles are happening there. However, the price the Russians pay daily is massive. Hundreds of killed soldiers that basically have no choice but to keep on attacking Ukraine settlements, despite the lack of support from the air and by the artillery. As we know, most of private Wagner Group are recruited convicts that were serving from 10 to 30 years in prison. They know if they refuse to attack Ukraine positions, they simply will be shot in the back by the Russian control team. Another direction of Russian offensive campaign was Crimea. Crimea offensive by the Russian force took place a few days ago. Crimea is located approximately 80 kilometers or 50 miles from the Bakhmut region. Russian forces launched a powerful counterattack in Crimea located in suburbs of Severodonetsk of Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine, involving 237th Armored Regiment, at least two motor rifle regiments, and well supported by artillery. They were able to drive Ukrainians away from the northern and southern fringes of the town, but failed to advance in western direction. Actually, the center prong of that counterattack was stopped cold well to the east of the Dibrova village. This was a costly operation involving too few forces to achieve anything meaningful and run in disorganized manner. Bakhmut. This is the only area where the Russians managed to take some advances in the last 2 weeks. North of Bakhmut town, on January 25th, the private Wagner Group and Russian airborne forces have crossed the Bakhmutska River and advanced into several villages in the region toward the very important M03 highway in the west. A few villages were left by Ukrainian troops, though. Instead, Ukrainians entrenched in better offensive positions in the hills above several settlements, having an excellent field of fire upon whatever is moving below them. Moreover, the Ukrainian forces has meanwhile brought in another artillery brigade. Currently, the Ukrainians have the 40th, 43rd, and 45th brigades there. Now they've been reinforced by another one to the Bakhmut area. The private Russian army Wagner Group still had no firm control of the village. It was losing troops while trying to establish any kind of positions there. As a result of the last week fighting, Bakhmut remains under Ukrainian control, and the M03 highway remains open for the flow of Ukraine reinforcements and supplies, and used for evacuation of the wounded. We know this highway is strategically important highway for Ukraine armed forces. The Russians doing all its best to cut Ukrainians from this highway, to cut off all the supplies that the Ukrainian army needs desperately. Indeed, the reorganization of the Ukrainian garrison seems to have been completed. The 61st and 63rd Mechanic Brigade, supported by the 1st Tank Division, are now holding the line north of the town. The 1st Special, the 3rd Assault, the 24th Mech and the 57 Motor Rifle are holding Bakhmut, and the 28th and 60th Mechanized Infantry Brigades are holding the southern side. Foremost, instead of elements from many units, most of involved brigades are now present in full force, and that usually means that they have 4 to 5 battalions in the area. Several brigades are also held in a reserve just in order to support or reinforce the army. Another direction of Russian offensive is Vuhledar constant fighting. The Vuhledar town is located in the Donetsk region, was the scene of another major counterattack by the Russian Federation in the last few days. On January 25th, the Russians deployed the rebuilt 40th and the 155th Naval Infantry Brigades, Vostok Battalion, Cascade Battalion, and several minor units of the Russian intelligence, and at least a regiment of specially trained units to assault from Mikilsky village over the front toward north. Announced by the Russians, the big offensive, and regardless how often repeated, all the attacks have been smashed by Ukrainian artillery, with heavy losses in Russians, battle tanks, and infantry fighting vehicles. The mass of involved Russian units never managed to at least enter the range of Ukrainian machine guns. On January 27th, the Ukrainian armed forces counterattacked the nearest Russian group forces south of Vuhledar town and overrun it. As of the last night, the Russians were thus back to their starting positions east of village Pavlivka. So in the last week, southern Zaporizhia and the Dnipro front were pretty quiet. The last 2 weeks, as usual, few small actions, but no achievements by the Russian troops were recorded. Lately, it's been noted the lack of effectiveness of Russian artillery. This is still superior in the Russian artillery is still superior in numbers to that of the Ukrainians, at least by 5-6 times. But as announced already back in June, July of the last year, due to the cold weather, its Orlan drones are out of action, or when used, crashing, having frozen optics, etc. The Russians remain short on forward controllers, and its communication remains poor. Thus, and for most of the time, the Russian artillery is firing blind. Of course, it must be expected this to change very soon when the weather gets better. A major geopolitical risk outfit were arguing this week that another wave of Russian escalation through asymmetric channels could be looming, and this could well have impact on global markets. However, it's not that easy for Putin to accomplish this anymore. First, what's the trigger now and not a month or 2 months ago? Lots of red lines for Putin have come and gone, and he has not done very much in terms of really pushing back against NATO. As you remember, thinking of the naval ship Moskva, Ukrainian liberated Kharkiv region, the Kherson region, supply of ever more sophisticated Western weapons going through the gears of MiG-29s fighter jets, tanks, T-72s, HIMARS, and now Leopard tanks that is being delivered to Ukraine. I think we have learned here that Putin is actually scared of NATO, as he knows Russia would lose a conventional war with NATO very quickly, especially now after Russia lost so many soldiers in the last 10-11 months and the army is completely worn out. Russian army has never been able to be at least compared to the NATO weapons and the army. However, now Russian army looks even weaker and has no chance to win this war. Escalation dominance here means that Putin needs Ukraine more than the West, and he's willing to do almost anything to take over Ukraine, while the West is not. So what we have learned that while he might care more about Ukraine than the West does, instead, he cares about his own preservation, and he doesn't want to end his days miserably, killed by his own friends or allies, or opposition, or spend the last of his days in jail. Obviously, the Ukrainians care more about Ukraine than Putin, and more particularly, the conscripts and cannon fodder Putin is deploying to Ukraine. Ukraine have no choice. They have nowhere to go. Also, Putin knows that anything which he does impacts global markets will quickly bring China and the global south in against him. They have been key allies, and he will not want to annoy them. Also, Putin has been doing all that anyway, but it has been blocked, countered by the West. And the more he does, the more the West will retaliate, and they still have more capacity there to hurt Russia. Think of energy. Are we now past the peak of what he can do? We are almost through the winter. So he could halt gas supplies through Ukraine and Russian LNG to Europe, but this is still running combined less than one-third normal flows. Will cutting this make that much difference? And if he does, it's likely it will just hurt key friends in Central Europe: Hungary, Austria, and Serbia. More likely, I think, is we see military escalation in Ukraine. According to the latest recruiting campaigns, Russia now has 350,000 troops in Ukraine and 150,000 in the environs. That is close to double what they had in the initial invasion. The Ukrainians are also talking about invasion too, to mark the 1 year anniversary. I think a Russian offensive is quite likely, but I still doubt Russia has the capacity to win the war. Likely Putin will look to take some more momentum or leverage on the battlefield gained from a new offensive into the new peace talks. At the moment, he's negotiating from weakness. He wants to change that. As we know, lately, Putin tried to approach negotiation through several countries, including Brazil. He's desperately looking for negotiations because he knows he doesn't have that capability to win this war. The Ukrainian army is getting stronger, and the Russian army is losing its power day by day, week by week. And there is also talks about the new Ukrainian offensive in the spring, but likely they want to wait for the arrival of those 2 or maybe 300 Western tanks, which could be crucially in turning any Russian offensive to their advantage. The base case scenario is Russia launches a new offensive this month, and Ukraine exploits it to its advantage, trying to split Russian forces, perhaps a thrust south through Zaporizhia to cut the land corridor to Crimea for Russia. In order to take initiative in this war, we need more tanks and fighter jets. Ukraine has spent many months to convince the West to provide main battle tanks. The tank coalition, which we proposed back in October, is now, thanks God, already taking shape because the European Union countries have more than 2,000 Leopard 2 and Leopard 1 tanks in service. If each state gives at least a small share, then we could already form such a combat wing. 200 or 300 tanks would be, even in the opinion of our military, a sufficient factor to really plan a spring counteroffensive. As of today, 15 countries announced commitment to provide tanks to Ukraine within the next few months. According to Ukraine government officials, we can receive close to 320 tanks by this summer, and all these tons have already been committed to Ukraine. However, it will take some time for these tanks to be delivered to Ukraine. It will take time to train Ukrainian soldiers to operate these machines. So, We hope that in 2-3 months, or by the summer, the whole tank division will be at the front lines. The political pressure that Ukraine managed to create on the current government, if you like, especially on Mr. Olaf Scholz, is currently large and powerful. Since the middle of October, the decision to provide tanks to Ukraine or not were made only under the massive pressure that Ukraine was trying to create. In one way or another, the government made the decisions we hoped for. Why Olaf Scholz behaved like that? No one has no one has an explanation. The Germans themselves are coming up with the various conspiracy theories there that Putin scared him somewhere, not only with a nuclear war, but with some acts of revenge on the territory of Germany, missile strikes, or whatever he could come up with. It's not known there, but the Germans themselves are so shocked by this blocking position, it is obvious that no one can find a logical relational explanation for this because Ukraine is not just protecting its land, but also trying to defend the path to other European countries that can become the next goal for Putin. The war's clock is ticking. Both sides are preparing for the crucial battle coming this spring. Ukraine is scrambling to repel the Russian offensive, prepare for a potent and massive offensive of its own, and at the minimum, hold its defensive positions until the arrival of the new Western weapons. At the same time, Russia is accumulating as much personnel as weaponry as possible, as quickly as possible, in order to be the first to attack and break through the Ukrainian armed forces front lines. The enemy understands time is not in their favor anymore. They are aware that around 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers are overseas being trained to new armored vehicles, tanks, rocket systems, NATO fighter jets, and other weapons. It's evident Russia no longer has the goal of taking over the entire country, given its exhausted army and dwindling resources. They want only to occupy the Luhansk and Donetsk regions as of now, celebrate the victory, and sell it to the nation that this special operation had a reason. Russia also understands that this might be their last strong push, and if Ukraine holds it and takes the offensive initiative, it might be the pivotal moment we have been waiting for. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening for my podcast. Please share this podcast with your friends and listen to our earlier podcast. Thank you.